I'm Nikki Jovicic from LookUpStrata and also the Managing Director of Tower Body Corporate on the Gold Coast. Today we're joined by Scott Bellerby from Strata and Damien and Moran from Energy-Tec. With the take-up of electric vehicles on the rise, our Strata scheme's private car parks will become the EV charging stations of the future. Is your building ready? Car parks are the convenient and practical location for EV charging. Retrofitting EV charging stations is a new and potentially complex process for strata communities. Schemes need to be well equipped to deal with requests for installing EV charging stations. Damien and Scott are here to reveal the naked truth of how the energy network configuration in a scheme directly impacts energy billing, who pays, how much, and the savings opportunities. They'll also outline the key steps for an energy roadmap showing an equitable EV charging solution. We remind everyone that this is a WA session, and while there are similarities between states regarding EV charging in strata buildings, any reference to legislation is specific to the state of WA. Now, before we begin, I'd like to mention that the information contained in this session, including the discussions that arise from submitted questions and also chat conversations, is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as legal advice. You should seek independent advice before acting on the information contained in the session. We're joined by Scott Bellerby from Strata and Damien Moran from Energy-Tec. With 2 decades of property experience, Scott is regarded as WA's leading strata expert. Scott started Strata in 2014. He was president of SCA WA from 2016 for a 4-year term, and he worked extensively on the 2020 reforms to the legislation to ensure a balanced and effective review of Strata Titles Act. He's now leading a review of these reforms. Scott's aim is to see the strata industry recognised for its professionalism and expertise. Scott also sits on numerous boards and committees. Strata are industry leaders in WA, and Strata continues to revolutionise management processes and drive efficiencies in this space. They continuously look to find ways to innovate and evolve, and their mission is to create harmonious, sustainable communities. Damien is Managing Director of Energy-Tec and a current board member of SCA. He has over 34 years of technical and business experience in mechanical services, building efficiency, and energy and property services. His area of expertise is in energy operations, management and reporting for embedded energy networks and future-proofing property assets in readiness for electrification and emissions reduction. Damien is actively involved as a key stakeholder in energy policy advocacy, representing the interests of the strata community. This is the 3rd webinar session Scott has joined us for, and both Energy-Tec and Strata regularly appear in the WA Strata magazine. So we welcome you both for joining us today for this really exciting session.
Good morning to the audience.
Good morning. Okay. So thank you very much for everybody's time. The discussion is retrofitting EV charging stations into strata. We're going to provide an overview of some trends and challenges experienced by strata schemes. We'll dive into some legislative and compliance topics. We'll then move into EV charging integration into your electricity network, and then talk about some of the safety risks related to EV charging, and also then drive into the key messages. So from an overview perspective, most people would be aware that EVs are arriving very fast. There's a modest take-up at the moment, and most people would see that as with a sort of growing number of cars being visible EVs out in on the roads. And some of you would be aware because EVs are arriving in your car parks, in your garages, in your undercover car parks, multi-dwelling car parks and the like, and you've possibly got people asking you for connections and how they can charge at effectively their home. Some of the statistics I've just got on the right-hand side here show some various scenarios. For example, in 2025, this particular graph shows 3 scenarios in terms of thousands of EVs that will be on the road. And the lowest is around 20,000. The medium is around 70,000 vehicles, and the high-end estimate is up to 150,000. And as you can see, as it heads towards 2028, the estimates are that as much as 20% of the vehicles on the road will be EV charging EVs and require EV charging. The medium is about 50,000 or 10% of vehicles on the road. Either way, it pretty much identifies and outlines that importance to provision and be ready for EV charging in our schemes. And the other piece is, of course, that 1 in 5 Australians live in strata, which is a huge proportion of people that will face the associated challenges when attempting to charge and store their EV. So what are some of the trends? Well, one of the key trends is the cost of energy, and the two elements related to people making decisions about whether to, or not to buy an EV is the price, is that entry price, and the other is the cost of electricity or cost of charge. And the EV Council of Australia have released a number of pieces of data over the journey, and this is one from a little while back, but it's very relevant that it identifies that most cars charged at home will cost about 33 cents for the equivalent litre that would cost you approximately $1.50, or as we know at the moment, up to $2 a litre right now. So that's 1/5 of the cost of charging a vehicle. I was with a colleague last night who owns a Tesla, and the calculation was $15 from home to charge their car, which is just incredible. However, the cost of EVs is obviously high. And so the entry level of that is a bit of an inhibitor for most. But the trends are showing that as EV purchase prices fall and more of the vehicles become available on the market that are cheaper and more affordable, we will see that take up. So what other challenges are we seeing? A big one is equity concerns. So individual EV owners want to access charging. However, strata schemes want to establish an equitable solution before approving those requests, which is a very fair expectation. If not well thought out, those first adopters could potentially secure an electrical charging solution that possibly inhibits the later adopters from the same level of access for electricity. So an equitable solution is really important, and that's absolutely achievable with the technology that's available. Some strata schemes are introducing bylaws also to prevent EV charging devices until they can develop or formalise a roadmap for EV charging. Another challenge, a key challenge, is capacity at a property. So the ability for that site to service the additional load that comes from electric vehicle charging. And most people probably aren't aware, but a vehicle charging up uses about the same as an average apartment while it's charging. So it's like having an additional apartment connected to your network during that period. And fast chargers use a huge amount more in those circumstances. So the decision as to whether to install fast or slow chargers or medium chargers is a critical element of the review process for suitability for a property. So many buildings don't have the required electrical infrastructure. That's the switchboards and the distribution boards to actually connect EV charging. And then most buildings don't have the adequate spare capacity. And that's where this little infographic on the right shows a maximum limit where as you add more EVs, you can cross that limit that starts to cause the potential risk of the site being overloaded from an electricity perspective. And it's very much about considering the existing infrastructure because it's there to service your apartments, your villas and your townhouses. And if you add load to that for the purpose of EV charging, you need to protect that core role that electricity requires to service your home. And so that's very much one of the thought processes in terms of how you deploy equitable solutions so that EV is in effect the secondary option of charging in the peak times of the day and is the primary charger, for example, late at night and at other times when the load coming from the residential component of the complex isn't as high. And this is true for older and even recent buildings. We've seen old buildings with lots of spare capacity that have been built with lots of provisioning, and we've seen some new buildings with zero capacity or very, very limited capacity. So it's very much about an individual assessment to determine what that is. And that's basically connecting some test equipment to the incoming supply or drawing data from Western Power to do that analysis to see what is available. And there's always important to need a buffer in the case of peak periods like summer when everyone's air conditionings are running as well. And all of those devices are competing for electricity at those peak times. and the peak times are the highest risk type periods where you could run into problems. Another challenge is energy billing, the setup of the energy billing in your scheme. Subject to the type, who your supplier of electricity is, can have an implication on how you approach the deployment of EV charging in your scheme. On the left, we have that sample of what's referred to as a multi-master network. Now, that basically means that every scheme, every lot owner has a direct account with retailer Synergy in Western Australia, which is the state-owned electricity retailer, and they are the sole service provider for electricity for all residential properties in Western Australia, consuming less than 50,000 kilowatt hours. And on the right, we have the embedded network model where the scheme purchases electricity for the entire complex under one service level or supply agreement. And then the scheme manages the distribution of the billing and the costs, usually through a third-party provider such as Energy-Tec and your Strata manager. So a little bit more detail on those models. The multi-master is where occupants purchase that electricity from the retailer Synergy, as I mentioned, and that's usually under the A1 tariff or similar, which is a regulated energy tariff. The complete ownership scheme is where the property owns all of the electricity infrastructure and the sub-meters that they use on every lot to read the energy use. But they usually procure it for a better rate because they're buying electricity under what's known as the retail contestable market. And that means they can negotiate better energy prices, and then they can choose to either save and pass through the savings or pass through to the same rate that Western Power charge and redirect the income to their scheme. And there's about 450 schemes in WA that do this way. Then the third version is where individual lots might purchase the electricity from a third party that may not be Western Power, but might be either a similar in a retailer or someone that owns the meters and charges fees for access to that service, and usually sells the electricity directly to the resident as well. So being aware of those elements are really important because that will determine who actually has control of your network in many ways and how that might impact your setting up a supply of electricity for your car park. So I'll jump over to Scott.
Thank you, Damien. Yes, in the end, what's critical, I think, for owners to take away from today's presentation is you need to start taking control of how EVs may come into your building or your scheme. By not taking ownership of it, you'll run the risk of what we faced when internet first became available and schemes decided to allow owners to connect to the communication board. Sometimes that might be within the building, sometimes it might have even just been on the street. And what we saw where, going back to the revolution of the internet, was individual owners and tenants and residents running cabling from the street through the scheme into their apartment. And you ended up with cabling on top of cabling on top of cabling. And a lot of buildings are still dealing with that legacy issue throughout their scheme and their service ducts, where there's just multiple cabling, where in the end, if the scheme did take ownership, and some schemes did, you had a more efficient setup. And this is the risk which you face with EVs as they come in. Owners are entitled to run utility metering through the scheme when they need a service. It does create a few problems when you're then bolting on charges to the wall, and we'll get into that a bit further in my presentation. But the key thing is you need to start thinking about it, and you need to start planning, because if you don't, it will turn into a spaghetti factory. Worst case, you risk the building shutting down as you reach those peak loads, which Damien spoke about, or in the ultimate worst case, the building can catch fire, and that's the bigger risk which we face here. And that's why you really need to start having a look at what you're doing. You need to understand the limitations of the scheme, understand your capacity constraints, understand your infrastructure constraints. And then really you need to start a management plan, which you would look to slowly implement through the scheme over the course of the next few years. Yeah, and that involves consulting with the owners and the residents and letting them know, so that, you know, they don't run off tomorrow and buy their electric vehicle and then want to plug it in and then suddenly realizing that they can't do that. So you need to adopt a plan and let the residents know. It's important that, you know, each state is unique with regards to their legislation and how they handle the provision of utilities. So you need to understand what your legislation requirements are and what, as a scheme, you're actually allowed to say no to. And this is where it becomes important that you review your existing bylaws. Think about those bylaws that may be limiting with regards to use of, for example, visitor car bays. You know, visitor car bays, a lot of schemes will have a bylaw that says visitor car bays are only for visitors. But if you're wanting to provision as a first step, maybe just EV, you know, electric vehicle chargers into your visitor car bays as a starting point, you need to change arguably the bylaws as they pertain to the scheme. And then by adopting a bylaw that allows for the introduction of electric vehicles, it can then actually set the scheme up for moving forward. And of course, you know, you need to start budgeting. You know, luckily here in WA, we have a requirement for the 10-year maintenance plan. The hope is that I'm consulting with Landgate now, and part of that 10-year plan will actually start to think about including the electrical infrastructure and preparing for electric vehicles. So this point is based on the WA legislation. I know we have a lot of national viewers here today, so unfortunately you're going to have to deal with the legislation in this slide. But what I've actually assumed here is that the proposal is that an owner would like to install an electric vehicle charger in their bay. And how does the WA legislation deal with that? Well, as I've mentioned, Section 63 of the WA legislation empowers an owner to be able to cable or run a utility, and they're entitled to an easement benefit through that into their lot or into their car bay. So they actually are entitled to be able to cable. You know, the requirement is that, you know, there's actually no approval required from the scheme, but in doing the cabling, you can't interfere with the use and enjoyment of the other lots within the scheme or the common property. And you also need to ensure that you provide appropriate documentation. So you actually can't stop an owner from doing the cabling. But ultimately, there's no point in doing the cabling if they then can't bolt on the electric vehicle charger. So that is arguably where Section 64 would step in. Yeah, and in the end, most of the time you're arguably bolting the electric vehicle charger onto common property. So in WA, you would look to enact an infrastructure contract. That would still require an ordinary resolution be passed for an owner wanting to do it. And within that infrastructure contract, it would entitle the owner to enter and pass over the common property. They can install and remove the infrastructure within the easement area that they're granted. They can, of course, operate the infrastructure within the easement area, which they've been granted a contract to be able to do, but maintain, and of course, you will be granted prior approval. A part of that infrastructure contract may allow for the scheme to vary the contract if at a later date they do implement a more inclusive management plan for the introduction of electric vehicles. So it also should consider that. The alternative methods with regards to being able to put in an electric vehicle charger would include an exclusive use bylaw, and that's for WA resolution without dissent. So it can be a little bit challenging. There is also the lease of common property or a license over common property. So there's a couple of other methods there for a scheme to be able to grant approval for an electric vehicle charger in the scheme. With regards to, I guess, the compliance, and I know a lot of the questions that we received earlier were talking about bylaws. When it comes to drafting bylaws, I've got a basic example here. It is important that you get appropriate advice with regards to the bylaws for your scheme, because every scheme is unique. Without adopting a bylaw, and if you're just subject to the standard legislative bylaws, you have limited control over how you might prohibit or inhibit or allow an electric vehicle charger to be installed within the scheme when an owner makes application. So it is very important that you do get a bylaw. Adopt it sooner rather than later. It's always a lot easier to put in this bylaw when there isn't any conflict within the scheme around electric vehicle charging. So I do encourage you to adopt this bylaw sooner rather than later. But the bylaw would arguably limit an owner from being able to install an electric vehicle charging station without the consent of the Strata company. And knowing how complex this is, the Strata company may need to engage their own consultant to assist them in understanding the application an owner has made. So the Strata company may need to charge a fee. It would require an owner to enter into a license agreement or an infrastructure contract with the Strata company. It may be important, once you've understood the limitations of your electrical infrastructure, that the bylaw will limit the charging capacity of the electric vehicle station. It might be 7 kilowatts. I think you wouldn't want to go much over a 15 kilowatt charging unit. But again, that really comes down to understanding your electric infrastructure and how you may need to regulate that. Certainly, you would look to implement a load management system within the scheme. And you may want to designate where and how the electric vehicle station is connected to the electrical infrastructure. So you certainly would want to ensure that the electric vehicle station is metered. You don't really want to be paying as a resident within the scheme for an owner to charge their vehicle, and so therefore it is critical that you ensure when the electric vehicle charging station gets connected, that there is a meter to enable to record that consumption of the electricity. And there may need to be a little bit more detail within the bylaws on how that will be on billed and that charge is recovered. Certainly, you want the bylaw to enable the Strata company to withhold its consent. If they don't have the ability for multiple charging stations to be introduced into the scheme. As I mentioned, you might want to be able to authorise a preferred provider of an electric vehicle charging station, and you may require that the owner or the resident in granting that approval will of course take all liability with regards to that station and how it would function. And noting that if you're an investor and you have installed an electric vehicle charger, and therefore you have a tenant and your tenants do change, it may require that each time there is a change in tenant, that the occupier actually has to undertake an induction and understands the use of how the EV charger will work. So that's the bylaw overview. Again, you should get legal advice with regards to what the requirements are for your scheme, because every scheme is unique. And I'll pass back to Damien.
Thanks, Scott. So when it comes to the integration of the EV system into your electricity network, the crossover with our little chat there was that that current energy billing setup is critical. And there's opportunity, if you are an embedded network, to simply add the EV charging system or devices that are included into your property to your existing bill via the additional meter. So there are some very cheap methods of passing through those costs if that's what the scheme is looking to do. Something else critical is the condition of the electrical infrastructure. If it's antiquated and old and has already, and you're aware that it's got problems, chances are the cost of the requirements are that when an electrician comes and adds equipment to an existing electrical switchboard, if that switchboard's in poor condition, they're actually required by law to call that out and to flag the risks and recommend the rectification of those issues to become compliant. And so those elements often mean that sometimes, in some instances, in the worst cases, the switchboard needs to be upgraded along with the addition of the actual extra equipment. So that's a big consideration. That capacity limitation that we talked about being quantified and understood so that the solution accommodates those capacity issues. Understanding that layout of the electrical infrastructure. If you've got drawings, they are like gold. They are so valuable if you've got electrical drawings, and if you invest some time digging those out and finding them, they will save you a lot of money when it comes to a solution, because really anything has to be extended on that existing infrastructure. And if you've got documentation around that installation, it saves a lot of extra investigation. And if it's up to date, often a good solution is to update that drawing too with current information, and that's usually a service that should be available. And the other bit is the ownership structure of car parks. We've seen examples where some schemes, obviously, each lot is allocated and has ownership of an individual car bay or multiple car bays under their unit entitlement, or they share the car park and they share the car bays, which opens up flexibility to come up with different means. We've had an example recently of a scheme that is has a lot of short stay accommodation, and as such they've agreed to share the EV car bays because they can see the income generation opportunities that it derives over and above their short stay as an extra value add. And so that's working, it's a good solution for them. And all of these items needed to be developed before you can really establish that equitable solution. So the high level steps are a review phase, a verification phase, a compliance and an implementation phase, the procurement, which is actually buying and installation and project implementation, and then ultimately it's the operation, that integration into your cyclic billing processes, so that the right people are getting charged for the electricity and the scheme isn't being adversely or negatively affected by those EVs being deployed, EV chargers. So we're going to focus in on this review phase predominantly, and basically this is about capturing all the elements and all the important elements to note, and then it usually goes into a more of a formalized validation of what was identified in the feasibility that forms a formal plan that can then be documented and formally costed, but the budgets are usually very accurate anyway. So the review phase is about EV charging feasibility, which addresses and looks at that condition of that infrastructure and its life cycle compliance. Access to charging, that scalability, the available capacity, as we said, the risk mitigation solutions required for that, and the need for load balancing. It looks at the solution of those elements. The big one's fire risk mitigation. There's a lot of concern around that. There's some good information from FISA and other parties now and about how to mitigate risk when it comes to fire on EV chargers or EVs. EV weight, in some cases, EVs can be very heavy with the EVs with long distance batteries, and that may have a structural bearing on car bays that are multi-level. That electrical connection and hardware cost and budgets, that's the real element of, okay, what do we have to install? Not only the EV charger itself, but also the cabling and the distribution boards all the way back. The indicative cost solution, the layout, so actually marking up a car park, which I'll show an example of. Charge times, when it comes to peak times, what the peak and off-peak benefits might be. and charge rates. It's the scheme's decision, especially where it's an embedded network, in terms of what you end up charging for electricity. You can opt to save or profit. So this is just an example of a drawing of a car park layout, and it shows the central elements with lifts and elements here with lift lobbies and the like. It also shows the location of the main site switchboard, which is the supply of electricity distributing throughout the rest of the building. And in this case, we've recommended an additional distribution board that has capacity and is cabled out to the 4 car bays that are here that are earmarked for charging. But the intent here is that the first 4 are installed, but there's provision for as much as 36 in that distribution board for future installation, acknowledging that over time more car bays will be absorbed. And we've also provided a second option here for a second distribution board if it was a large car bay that services another 36. And that's 36 single-phase EV chargers, which equates to about 7 kilowatts of charge. The alternative is to have the same thing in 3-phase, which is the 22 kilowatt version or option, and there are multiple options like that, but that version would provide for 12 EV chargers that could possibly also be ramped down to 7 kilowatts or lower kilowatts if equitability was an issue in time. So understanding that layout, understanding what the physical provisioning might be, where you might start with the distribution board implementation, and that might be a strata scheme cost, and that would include the metering solution and the load balancing solution, all deployed into that distribution board as an extension of your main site switchboard that then facilitates for a progressive rollout of EV chargers from 1 to, as I mentioned, up to 12 or 36. So something that a lot of people aren't aware of is the electrical ownership of electrical equipment in a building. And this little graph shows, and I'm sorry, it's a very fine, but hopefully you can have a closer look when you can have a look at the PDF that we supply in conjunction with this presentation. You've got an embedded network, which is the vertical, you've got a multi-master network, and you've got that third-party version as well. And the key is at the top element of the foundation of electrical infrastructure, the switchboards, the cabling between switchboards and distribution boards, which are usually the boxes that are sitting on the floors if you're in a multi-level apartment building on every level. And also other boards, tenant boards, common area services for lifts and for air conditioning plant and all sorts of other things. All of that electrical infrastructure is owned in every instant by the scheme. And the scheme has the risk and responsibility for continuous reliable supply. You have the life cycle responsibility, it's your asset, and you have to keep it active. What's interesting is that the various versions with an embedded network, a multi-master and a third party, is that the meters, which are the key tool to actually, whoever owns the meters controls the billing, is that they are the income generating assets, the meters, the battery, EV, the battery charger, solar as an income generator, and the EV chargers, they're all income generation assets. And really, the configuration of your network in terms of who you're buying electricity from, it's the income generating assets that the big organization that everyone wants. They want your solar, they want your EV charger, and they want to sell you electricity, potentially specifically to those EV chargers. But if you own those assets, you have a lot more control. And it's very important to understand that ultimately you still own that infrastructure and you are responsible for the costs of supplying that electricity to its end use, be it an apartment or an EV charger. So the best practice model might be that you have maintained that complete ownership if you can facilitate that. It would mitigate rising energy costs when you have renewables deployed. The complete scheme ownership enables the supplementation of renewables, which is also can become an equitable solution. Clearly, solar reduces emissions. It gives you those provisions for EV charging. You can either save or you can generate income, and you can outsource that reading billing service as a fee for service. So the verification and compliance element, as we mentioned, once you've done that feasibility, you can roll into a formal scope and costing, which it really gets into the detail. the feasibility is intended to be a cheap first look to give you that foundation information that you can then derive next steps from with recommendations. And you can formalize that into that design, and you can discuss what requirements are, and you can address all of those balancing and metering issues. And you can put a plan together. And that plan can come with timelines and deliverables, which gives the scheme and lot owners some surety that as to understanding when these systems may be deployed. Some of those baseline inclusions include, as we mentioned, switchboards, distribution boards, cable trays running across the ceiling of your car park, or maybe if it's an open car park, it might need to be underground or connected to a shading facility of some kind. And the goal with EV charging is to have a consistent solution that if you pick an EV brand and type, that you stick with that over the duration, because they talk to each other and they communicate with each other. And if they're all the same system, they can management becomes cheaper and easier to facilitate. As I mentioned, load balancing is critical, which allows these to talk to each other and actually manage that load. And the metering and billing solution is critical, because that's where the ongoing charges of accessing systems like EV chargers and the online services all come with fees. So it's understanding what those fees are and understanding what the benefits of those fees of those online tools are, whether you need them in their entirety or not. So to Procure, it's about the approvals process, as Scott's pointed out, scheme approvals, bylaws and resolutions. It's about the procurement phase is appointing a design and implementation, the project, whoever is providing you that solution. But it also ties into your supply agreement, because you're purchasing electricity, you'll be purchasing more electricity, and that supply agreement is intrinsic to that component, because if you buy more electricity, you can negotiate better rates, but you can also, you may exceed peak limits that are sitting within your agreement. And the other bit is modifying the service level agreement of your cyclic reading and billing to incorporate that EV charging system into the standard billing and reading process. How might you fund these things? You might fund it with cash, you might fund it via a hire purchase arrangement or a lease. But the key is to retain the ability to procure the electricity, but for the scheme to on-sell it at those regulated tariffs, generate that income, which effectively can pay back the investment. So the operation piece is to deploy an EV scope that will support the long-term viable operation of the system, and to protect that return on investment, and to derive the ongoing savings or on-sell income, and to integrate it with the billing network, as I mentioned. And as we pointed out, when EVC systems have set up well, they can self-fund the entire life cycle and maintenance of the equipment, including the ongoing billing system and its services. Oops. So on to risk and safety for Scott.
Okay, thanks, Damien. Yeah, I guess looking at the risks and safety, we'll move through this as quickly as we can. As Damien highlighted, you install your distribution boards. What you should do is make sure those distribution boards are clearly marked for the provision of electrical vehicle chargers. So in the event of an incident, the emergency services can quickly identify the distribution board and turn off the power. By not providing dedicated distribution boards within the scheme, the risk is that if you just let owners one by one cable to the main master switchboard, you could start exceeding the limits there, and then the building shuts down. Or if you do have a fault with the charger, every time there's that fault, it will trip the fuses in the main switchboard and the building shuts down. So having dedicated distribution boards is critical. Damien's already spoken about ensuring the distribution boards provide for load management and sub-metering. And if you really want to do this neatly, make sure you don't just put in the distribution boards, but you provide cable trays throughout the car parking area. The reason why you would go and take this approach is you don't want individual owners plugging in their cars to the common power supply. The cords, they're unsightly and they are a trip hazard. Also, you lose that equity within the costs of being able to charge the user. It's important that you review your fire evacuation plans. And where possible, knowing it is very difficult often in Strata because of part lot ownership, see if you can put your chargers away from main exit routes and the fire escapes. But certainly review your fire evacuation plans when you do start to implement electrical vehicle charging in the building. Review your fire systems. Battery fires do burn hotter, and there may be some concern with regards to the increased volume of water that needs to be provided in putting out a battery fire. So there may be some limitations with the diameter of your fire hoses, with regard to being able to provide that volume of water that needs to be provided to put out an electric fire. But I do say that in the end, Australia is at least 5 years behind where Europe is with regards to the introduction of electric vehicles, and we are learning a lot of lessons when it comes to the way Europe is approaching and rolling out electric vehicle chargers. And it's also worth noting that their buildings are several hundred years older than ours as well in a lot of instances, and they are doing it successfully. So there is a solution and we can do it. It can certainly be done safely as well. And certainly the insurance industry, it always continues to review risk being with regards to everything from cyclones to flooding to the introduction of electric vehicle chargers into buildings. And to date, the insurance industry doesn't consider provision of electric vehicles in Strata as posing a higher risk than the standard combustion engine vehicles. So I'll just quickly finish off with the key messaging. In the end, as Damien has highlighted, it's really important to understand your current setup and your scheme's infrastructure and your billing solution. You have to start planning now. Like, there's no point planning for the introduction of electric vehicle chargers when you've got like 6 or 7 owners wanting to do it, and you're rushing around trying to figure out how you're going to implement that within the scheme. Start planning now before that demand increases. Aim for an equitable solution. You have to look at the limitations and understand that is key, and that is the first step. Make sure you consult with the owners. Let them know that at the moment you don't have the ability to allow for electric vehicle chargers because of some of the limitations that may exist. Maybe there aren't those limitations, but make sure you consult. Tell the owners when it's going to happen and when they can expect to roll it out. Look at your bylaws, adopt appropriate bylaws, review your risk and safety measures around the scheme. In the end, you do need to consider that. And then, ultimately, best solution would be that the scheme retains ownership of it and has better control on how it's implemented within the Strata company. So,
that's it. I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thank you so much. That was great. It was very comprehensive. There's obviously lots and lots of information in there to go through. So I'd really recommend people, when we send the recording out, they do download the slides. There are probably buildings out there, people that are in buildings that are on the council or not on the council, and they know that these changes need to be made, and they might think their building's not moving fast enough, or they're not really paying attention to the need to get started on this. So I think this video is a great place to start if they actually can provide their council or sit down together even with the council and watch the video and work through it. And then that gives them the key steps that you've provided actually gives people a bit of a starting point so they can actually start to move forward. So we thank you very much for providing that information. I also loved the fact that you related it back, Scott, to the internet, when the internet came in and people had internet cords running into buildings. I wasn't aware, I wasn't involved in the Strata industry back there, so I had made that connection. And I think a lot of people out there that might be pushing back, if that analogies presented to them, it might make it a little bit more real to them, and they can maybe understand the situation a little bit more, and the reason we are sort of trying to get them moving and having a look at it and looking at solutions now rather than when it's too late down the track. So thank you very much for all of that information. One of the questions that we had come in was, after a metered installation is retrofitted with a wall-mounted charger at a car park, what is the reasonable fixed monthly or annual costs to an owner for maintenance, licensing, etc., for the system, excluding the electricity costs?
So the number ranges around the $20 or $30 a month for a online solution. I think the key is where it's the end use of that charger itself. There's public and there's private charging. Obviously, if it's in a car park, it's for the public access and the general public. So usually that's a online version where you can deploy a swipe card and you log on to an app of various solutions providers, and the owner of that EV charger pays a fee to access those systems, and that to keep that all up online. But it's very efficient from a payment perspective because it's immediately paid by credit card and the like. When it comes back to a residential environment where it's a privately owned EV charging environment, especially gated communities or car parks that have boom gates that are specifically for the exclusive use of residents, the solution can be much simpler and much cheaper, where the meter, a meter can be doing the billing independent of the charger, or the charger can be the billing solution as well. Now, there's all sorts of variations in that, and there's some risk in that. In the metering code in Australia is arguing whether the meters provided within an EV charger are adequate and meet requirement. But at the moment, most of the meters that have been installed into EV chargers are made overseas and do not fall under the National Metering Institute regulatory framework. And there's debate as to whether the Australian version will be adopted or whether Australia will adopt international standards. But all that means that at the moment, the jury is out. So the risk of deploying, it's a scheme decision as to whether they want to install an EV charger without a NIMI approved meter and possibly have to retrospectively do it or not in future once that regulation comes in. So EV charging could be as cheap as $10 per EV charge a month for the billing side of it. It could be as much as 30. That's probably the short answer.
So maybe one for you, Scott, that I was thinking of when we were looking at the example that Damien gave of the basement car park, and he had the 4 lots set out that were EV charging in kind of the corner of the car park. I know we'll be getting questions from people saying, how do you control that? How do you make sure that a resident parks there and doesn't leave a car there for 4 hours when it takes 10 minutes to fill up? How do you control who has access to that? Do you have to book the space? How would that work? Is there a solution to that?
No, in the end, this is where it really comes back to the management plan and understanding the demand within the scheme. How many owners are looking to buy an electric vehicle? Like I will note that from experience, as soon as a scheme does provision for being able to introduce electric vehicle charging, take up of electric vehicles is higher. So if you do provision it adequately, you'll suddenly see owners like, well, actually my scheme can do this. I'm now looking for a new car. I'm now going to consider an electric vehicle. So you will see take up is a lot quicker in a scheme that has put in the infrastructure to be able to provision for it. And then there's the other spectrum where if you're not looking at it, you don't want to do it. Of course, owners won't be that interested. So by provisioning for 4 bays, it very quickly may find that the plan will grow quicker than you anticipate. But to be able to actually control how long you park your car there, it really comes back down to your bylaws. If you don't have the bylaws providing that governance structure on how long you can park your car there, it's limiting and how you can get them to move on. And yeah, certainly in the end, what we are also seeing is that people will charge their car at work. So sometimes they might be able to get away with doing it without having to do it in the building. But it's often that quick charge up, and you don't. The time of being able to park there comes down to the capacity of the charger and how quickly you can do it.
Okay, so it then comes back to policing your bylaws and enforcing bylaws and keeping control of it that way as well. All right, thank you so much for that. Another one we were asked was, is the embedded network conversion the best and perhaps only path forward for EV charging? And if so, can you please outline the conversion milestones in the case of a southwest located strata complex built in 2003, consisting of 45 apartments, presently with the conventional electric metering system? And then they went on to say what would be the perfect case scenario, conversion timetable putting aside, and any inevitable bureaucratic procrastinations. And can you reference an already completed ENCWA strata conversion example?
Big question. I can. The first part of that question, does a property need to be an embedded network to deploy an equitable EV solution? The answer is no. In effect, the car park is its own infrastructure, and a network of electricity can be rolled out, whether it's an embedded network or a multi-master, as it's provided you provide a dedicated, and that's generally the common area, referred to as the common area or the house services. So it's bolstering the house service system, but in effect, what you're doing, you're creating a little mini embedded network that is the car park in that situation. And so that would require a reconciliation of the main use of that electricity with all the sub meters servicing the individual car bays. And there's simple ways of managing that. And then that's distributing those bills, those energy bills, out to tenants or lot owners, either on a monthly or bi-monthly path, or more regularly if they chose to, because EV fees, could be used more regularly. So it's not necessary. However, the buying power of electricity, if you are an embedded network, you're buying electricity for 100% of the property, not just the car bays. So you're going to negotiate a better electricity rate if you can facilitate it being an embedded network. It does tie back to that infrastructure and the ability to deploy a utility gate meter at the incoming supply of the property, and that sometimes requires modifications, which can be expensive. But in most cases, we see somewhere between a 1 and a 5 year payback of those sorts of infrastructure modifications to convert to an embedded network. We've always believed that when people start to have to look closely at EV charging as a topic, that it's going to force them to look back at their billing arrangements for their whole site property and have them looking closer at those entitlements. And electricity regulation in WA entitles property owners to schemes to on-sell electricity under the Electricity Act to small consumers. In terms of examples of conversions, there are some good examples out there. Most of those have involved infrastructure upgrade along with the conversion, and also addressing lots of other life cycle related elements. In some cases, even rerunning cables and the like, and increasing the capacity of the property. And some have also included EV charging solutions concurrent, in addition to solar solutions, because ultimately, if you're generating solar on the roof and you're feeding it straight into your EV charger, that's the most efficient and sustainable solution. And it's probably the aspirational solution, if you like.
Okay, thank you for that. But Damien, a lot of the information that you've presented would be relevant to different states. Apart from the legislation, the actual process that we're going through is similar in all states. Yep. Is that correct?
Absolutely. There's I'm on a CBIT committee, which is a national task force for EV charging that is part of the SCA, and there's a group, and there's a number of publications that have come out. There's a new one just about to come out as well.
Okay.
We have some baseline information on our website related to embedded networks and how they work, which might help people understand that fundamental. But there is more information coming for EV charging from Strata Communities Australia.
Thank you so much, Damien and Scott. It was really great to have you in here. I think it was really valuable information. I really enjoyed the session.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki.
For the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone.
If you gained value from this video, please hit like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're looking for information about parking, strata insurance, defects and more, head over to lookupstrata.com.au or sign up to our free weekly newsletter via the link in the description box below.